This time we recognize the gentleman from Ohio, Mr. Kucinich, for 5 minutes.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman, and thanks for holding this hearing. One of the things that's interesting about these hearings is that occasionally you get some insight into how people think in a broader sense about those they're supposed to serve. And I have to say that of the witnesses, Mr. Haldeman was the only one who seemed to understand the concerns that the American people have about this issue that faces this committee today. And so I want to thank you for that. I also want to say that in listening to the testimony, my concern is that there may not be enough sympathy for people who are losing their homes. And if there's a gap with tremendous pay being given to people at the top, and we don't see enough sympathy for people who are losing their homes, that may mean that you just don't get it. You're too far removed. Now, Mr. DeMarco, on November 1st, your general counsel wrote a letter to Ranking Member Cummings. He disclosed that last year Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac imposed $150 million in penalties against banks for not foreclosing on homeowners fast enough. According to your general counsel's letter, mortgage servicers were charged daily fees by Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac if they failed to process foreclosures within set deadlines. Here's what your general counsel wrote, quote, "To date, the top 10 servicers account for the bulk of the fees due. The total amount for all servicers after approving appeals and corrections is approximately $150 million for 2010. And this is stunning. With all the abuses going on with robo-signing and the filing of false court documents, Fannie and Freddie were charging massive fees against banks that failed to expedite foreclosures. Mr. DeMarco, were you aware of these penalties?
I am aware of them, Congressman, and I can explain them. These penalties are a result of the failure of mortgage servicers to perform under their servicing contracts with Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac in a way that are driving up costs to the American taxpayer. The servicers are under contractual obligations to Fannie and Freddie to mitigate losses. And in my exchange with Mr. Cummings earlier, I went into some detail about the effort we've undertaken to ensure that servicers are reaching out to troubled borrowers from the moment there's evidence of being troubled.
There's a point here that you're missing, and that is there was an Inspector General finding, you're familiar with it, that FHFA, quote, directed Fannie Mae to impose compensatory fees against the servicers for violating foreclosure timeline limits. Now, is that true, and did you actually direct Fannie or Freddie to impose those penalties in 2010?
It is true, Congressman, because it's driving up the cost of the American taxpayer.
So you were aware of the abuses going on, but you failed to address them in a timely manner? That's what the Inspector General reported.
With all due respect, Congressman, these are two different issues, and the compensatory fees that have been assessed have been done so with recognition and allowance for the delays in foreclosure processing, either due to assisting the borrowers to try to find a foreclosure alternative or because of foreclosure delays that have been driven by things external to the servicer's control.
Well, this IG report concluded that, quote, there were multiple indicators of foreclosure risk, abuse risk prior to 2010 that could have led FHFA to identify and act earlier on the issue, including, quote, consumer complaints alleging improper foreclosures, contemporaneous media reports about foreclosure abuses by Fannie Mae's law firms, and public court filings in Florida and elsewhere highlighting such abuses. Now, Mr. DeMarco, if you were aware of these abuses, why would you order hundreds of millions of dollars in penalties to try to speed up the process even further? Why would you do that?
I would like to again try to separate the abuses and the corrections that have been undertaken with regard to them with servicers not performing adequately in foreclosing on properties multiple years without any payment, because this is driving up the cost to the taxpayer. The longer we are foreclosing on properties that have had no payments for 2, 3 years or more, and all this time the American taxpayer is funding those mortgages, and it is also damaging local communities and it's damaging housing markets to have these properties sitting there with no action being taken against them. Congressman, with all due respect, I believe that this is an appropriate thing.
To you, sir, there was the IG report talked about supporting personnel overloaded with the volume of foreclosures. Documentation problems were evident, they said. You haven't disputed that. This is, members of the committee, what you have here is a situation where they're focusing on accelerating foreclosures and hurting our constituents. I'm from Cleveland. We have more foreclosures there than most areas.
Gentleman's time has expired. Mr. Walsh of Illinois is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you for being with us here today. A couple quick points and then an overall question. We talk in trillions, billions, and millions around here. We're $15 trillion in debt. Fannie and Freddie have been subsidized to the tune of about $170 billion the last 3 years. Executive compensation last year in 09 and 010 was about $35 million. Big numbers, they jump out. Just quickly, two smaller numbers jumped out at me. Fannie and Freddie paid outside compensation consultants $655,000 in 08 and $560,000 in 09 to determine their own pay structure. We paid outside consultants that much money to determine the pay structure. Does that sound right, Mr. Williams and Mr. Haldeman? Does that sound excessive?
Congressman, we hired, the company and the Board of Directors hired compensation consultants to help them structure a compensation program for men.
A little closer.
Congressman, the Board of Directors hired compensation consultants to work with them to develop a compensation program at the request of FHFA, and they worked in partnership with FHFA and the Treasury Department to develop that compensation.
$655,000 in 1 year to help you determine your pay structure. Mr. Haldeman, does that sound excessive?
It sounds like a lot of money, but there are compensation consultants that are required for the board in addition to the company's compensation consultant. So I think that number would include 4 consultants, if I get it right, because I think you were pointing out for both enterprises, so that would be 4 in total. But I agree it is a lot of money.
And one other quick point. On your testimony, Mr. Haldeman, you said that the 15 highest executives today are paid the same as, roughly the same as the top 5 a decade ago. I don't know that that's something to rave about. I mean, James Johnson, 91 to 98, earned $100 million in pay with the company. Franklin Raines, we remember that name, 99 to 05, earned more than $90 million from 98 to 03. Daniel Mudd earned $12 million in 05. I don't know that it furthers our topic here to compare what we're doing today with what executives made 15 years ago. Mr. Haldeman, I appreciate the tone you took, that you understand the outrage certainly that Congress feels, and in theory and in practice we reflect the outrage that's out there. But understand something, many members of Congress came here because this country's broke. Big freshman class of Republican and Democrats who most of whom left probably much higher paying positions to come here and serve this country because this country's broke. I'm not unusual. There are other members like myself who came here and turned down my health benefits, turned down any pension benefits, because we've all got to do something pretty quickly or we're going to be in a heap of trouble, and future generations are going to be in a lot of trouble. So I appreciate that you understand the outrage, but are you telling me that unlike Congress and some other departments in government, we're fundamentally not able to find people who need to do what they need to do at Fannie and Freddie for less than the amount of money in base pay and bonuses that we're paying folks? And if so, do you understand how a lot of people might find that hard to believe?
First of all, I think all of us appreciate the public service of the entire Congress and realize that many have made a personal sacrifice to take on those roles. And I commend Acting Director DeMarco for the public service that he's given the country. And there are many examples of people who have done that. The dilemma I face, maybe I can bring the numbers down a little bit in size. One of the important functions we perform at Freddie Mac is managing an investment portfolio. When I took over my job in August of 2009, that investment portfolio was $900 billion. We've brought it down continuously. It is now about $680 billion in size. There are people who are managing that portfolio. What I worry about is if they make a 1% mistake, that costs the taxpayer $6.8 billion. If they make a 0.1% mistake, it's $680 million. And the people that are required to effectively manage that money and that investment portfolio and not make those mistakes are highly skilled, sophisticated, seasoned people that have many, many opportunities for high-paying jobs. And we need some of them at Freddie Mac to make sure we don't make those mistakes.
Gentleman's time.
That's the dilemma.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Mr. Tierney for